Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The autumn of 1897 descended upon Harlan County, Kentucky, with an unusual heaviness, as if the mountains themselves sensed the tragedy that would soon unfold within their ancient shadows. The Crowe family estate sat perched on a hillside overlooking the Cumberland River, a sprawling plantation that had survived the Civil War through cunning business dealings and the exploitation of coal deposits recently discovered on their land. The manor itself was a testament to old Southern wealth attempting to reassert itself in the new industrial age, with its white columns stained by coal dust and its once pristine gardens now bordered by mining operations that scarred the landscape. Thomas Crowe, patriarch of the family, was a man whose presence commanded both respect and fear throughout the county. At 63 years old, he had built an empire through ruthless determination, transforming his inherited tobacco plantation into a coal mining operation that employed over 200 men. His face was weathered like old leather, his eyes the color of flint, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who had once worked alongside his laborers before wealth allowed him the luxury of distance. He sat in his study that October morning, reviewing ledgers that showed profits beyond what most men in Kentucky could imagine, yet his expression remained troubled. His son, Jonathan Crowe, 28 years old and heir to the family fortune, stood by the window watching the miners trudge toward the entrance of the main shaft. Jonathan possessed his father's sharp features but lacked the hardness that years of struggle had instilled in the older man. He had been educated in Lexington, exposed to ideas about labor reform and workers' rights that made him question the very foundation of his family's wealth. The tension between father and son had grown increasingly bitter over the past year, particularly regarding the treatment of the mining families who lived in the company houses that dotted the property. The source of that morning's discussion was a matter that had consumed Thomas Crowe's thoughts for months: the future of the family name and the consolidation of power with the neighboring Whitfield estate. Harrison Whitfield owned the largest tobacco operation in eastern Kentucky, and though his wealth came from a different source than the Crowes, his influence was undeniable. More importantly, Harrison had a daughter, Catherine, 23 years old and educated in a finishing school in Richmond. The proposed union between Jonathan and Catherine would create an alliance that would dominate the regional economy for generations. Jonathan had met Catherine twice before, both times at social gatherings where they had barely exchanged more than pleasantries. She was beautiful in the conventional sense demanded by their social class, with honey-colored hair arranged in the elaborate styles of the period, green eyes that seemed to look through rather than at people, and a practiced smile that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. There was something unsettling about her composure, a coldness that Jonathan attributed to the rigid upbringing she had received. Yet his father had already negotiated the terms of the marriage with Harrison Whitfield, and the announcement would be made at a harvest ball scheduled for the following month. What complicated this arrangement was the presence of Eleanor Morrison, a young woman of 21 who had entered Jonathan's life 6 months earlier under circumstances that already marked their relationship as impossible. Eleanor was the daughter of Robert Morrison, the foreman who oversaw the mining operations at the Crowe estate. Her father had worked for Thomas Crowe for 15 years, earning respect through his competence and loyalty, but his position, while elevated above the common miners, remained firmly within the working class. Eleanor herself worked as a teacher in the small schoolhouse that Thomas had established for the children of his employees, a gesture of philanthropy that also served to keep skilled workers tied to the estate. Jonathan had first noticed Eleanor during one of his inspections of the company facilities, a duty his father insisted he perform to prepare for eventual leadership. She had been leading a group of children in a reading lesson, her voice clear and confident as she helped a young boy sound out words from a worn primer. Unlike the calculated sophistication of Catherine Whitfield, Eleanor possessed a natural warmth that drew people to her. Her dark hair was simply arranged, her dress practical rather than fashionable, and her hands showed the evidence of real work. But it was her eyes, deep brown and filled with genuine emotion, that had captured Jonathan's attention. They revealed everything she felt, from the joy of seeing a child master a difficult concept to the sadness that flickered across her face when she witnessed the exhausted miners returning from their shifts. Their relationship had developed slowly, beginning with conversations about the education program and gradually evolving into meetings that both knew violated every social boundary of their world. Jonathan would find excuses to visit the schoolhouse, ostensibly to review educational expenses, and Eleanor would linger after her students departed, discussing literature and ideas with an intelligence that matched his own. They had shared stolen moments in the woods beyond the mining operations, where the autumn leaves created a canopy of gold and crimson, and where for brief periods they could imagine a world where class distinctions did not exist. But reality had a way of crushing such fantasies. Robert Morrison had discovered his daughter's involvement with Jonathan Crowe 3 weeks earlier, finding a note that Jonathan had foolishly sent to the schoolhouse. The confrontation that followed had been devastating for Eleanor. Her father, a man who prided himself on his integrity and hard work, felt betrayed not only by his daughter but by Jonathan, whom he had respected as a fair-minded young man despite the class divide. Robert had forbidden Eleanor from any further contact with Jonathan, and the pain in his voice when he explained the impossibility of such a relationship had broken Eleanor's heart more than any prohibition could have. Thomas Crowe had learned of the situation through his network of informants on the estate, and his reaction had been swift and merciless. He had summoned Jonathan to his study and delivered an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. Jonathan would marry Catherine Whitfield as planned, securing the family's future and fulfilling his obligations to the Crowe name, or he would be disinherited entirely and forced to make his own way in the world without access to the family's resources or influence. Furthermore, Thomas made it clear that any attempt to continue the relationship with Eleanor Morrison would result in Robert Morrison's immediate dismissal, along with the eviction of his family from their company house. The cruelty of this position was evident to Jonathan. Defying his father would mean condemning not only Eleanor but her entire family to poverty in a region where mining jobs were scarce and living conditions for the unemployed were brutal. The economic depression of 1893 had only recently begun to ease, and families without steady income faced genuine starvation. Jonathan was trapped between his love for Eleanor and his sense of responsibility, not just to his family but to the Morrison family whose fate now rested on his compliance. As October progressed, the weight of these circumstances bore down on all involved with crushing pressure. Eleanor continued teaching at the schoolhouse, but her students noticed the change in her demeanor. The warmth that had characterized her instruction was now shadowed by a profound sadness that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. She would stand at the window during breaks, staring toward the manor house where Jonathan lived, knowing that the distance between them was measured not in yards but in insurmountable social barriers. At night, she lay awake in the small bedroom of her family's company house, listening to her father's troubled breathing in the adjacent room and understanding that her relationship with Jonathan had placed her entire family at risk. Jonathan, meanwhile, went through the motions of preparing for his engagement to Catherine Whitfield. He attended social functions where the upcoming announcement was discussed with barely concealed excitement by families hoping to benefit from the union's influence. Catherine herself seemed neither enthusiastic nor reluctant about the arrangement. She approached marriage with the same calculated detachment she applied to all aspects of her life, viewing it as a transaction that would secure her position and provide the lifestyle she had been raised to expect. She made no pretense of love, and Jonathan appreciated at least this honesty, even as it highlighted the emptiness of what lay ahead. The mining operations continued with relentless efficiency throughout this period, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding above ground. Men descended into the earth each morning, their faces blackened by coal dust, their lungs slowly filling with the particles that would eventually kill many of them. They worked in darkness illuminated only by the lamps they carried, extracting the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution while receiving wages that barely sustained their families. Robert Morrison supervised these operations with his characteristic thoroughness, but those who knew him well noticed the change in his bearing. The discovery of his daughter's relationship with Jonathan Crowe had shaken his confidence in the social order he had always accepted as natural and immutable. The harvest ball where the engagement would be announced was scheduled for the last Saturday of October. Thomas Crowe had spared no expense in preparing for the event, determined to make it a display of power that would cement his family's dominance in the region. Workers had been transforming the manor's ballroom for weeks, installing crystal chandeliers imported from Europe and arranging decorations that spoke of wealth and refinement. An orchestra had been hired from Louisville, and caterers were preparing a feast that would feed 200 guests drawn from the elite families of eastern Kentucky and beyond. 3 days before the ball, Eleanor Morrison made a decision that would alter the course of events in ways no one could have predicted. She had spent the previous weeks in anguish, torn between her love for Jonathan and her understanding of the reality they faced. She had written him letters that she never sent, pouring out her feelings onto paper that she then burned in the small stove that heated her family's house. She had prayed for guidance in the small Methodist church where the mining families worshipped, finding no comfort in the platitudes about accepting one's station in life. And she had watched her father grow more withdrawn and troubled, understanding that her actions had damaged him in ways that went beyond mere disappointment. On that Wednesday evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and cast long shadows across the mining camp, Eleanor composed a final letter to Jonathan. Unlike the others, this one she intended to deliver. In careful script, she wrote words that expressed both her love and her release of any claim on his future. She acknowledged the impossibility of their situation and released him from any sense of obligation to her. She wished him happiness in his marriage to Catherine Whitfield and expressed hope that he would find purpose in using his position to improve the lives of the working families on the estate. It was a letter of heartbreaking maturity, written by a young woman who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. She entrusted the letter to Mary Sullivan, another teacher at the schoolhouse and her closest friend, asking her to deliver it to the manor house the following day when Jonathan would be alone in his study. Mary accepted the task with tears in her eyes, understanding the finality of what Eleanor was doing. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed listening to the sound of the wind moving through the bare tree branches, feeling both the pain of loss and a strange sense of peace that came from making an impossible decision. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans that would transform this private tragedy into something far more devastating. Thursday morning broke cold and gray over Harlan County, with fog rolling down from the mountains and settling over the valley like a shroud. Jonathan Crowe rose early, as was his habit, and dressed for another day of maintaining the facade that his life had become. He descended to the dining room where his father was already seated, reading a copy of the Louisville Courier-Journal and making notes on matters related to coal prices and labor disputes in other parts of the state. They ate breakfast in tense silence, a pattern that had become routine since their confrontation about Eleanor Morrison. Jonathan excused himself and retreated to his study, a room that had become his refuge from the oppressive atmosphere of the manor house. The walls were lined with books he had collected during his years of education, volumes on philosophy, literature, and social reform that represented ideals increasingly at odds with the reality of his family's business. He sat at his desk and attempted to review correspondence related to the upcoming ball, but his mind wandered constantly to Eleanor and the impossible situation they faced. Mid-morning, Mary Sullivan arrived at the manor house's service entrance, carrying Eleanor's letter in the pocket of her coat. She had been admitted by one of the household staff and was directed to wait in a small sitting room while they determined if Mr. Jonathan Crowe would receive her. The grandeur of the manor's interior overwhelmed Mary, who had never been inside the main house before. The polished marble floors, the oil paintings in gilded frames, and the ornate furniture spoke of a world completely removed from the modest homes of the mining camp. Jonathan agreed to see her, and Mary was escorted to his study. She entered nervously, clutching her handbag and clearly uncomfortable in these surroundings. Jonathan recognized her from the schoolhouse and invited her to sit, but Mary remained standing, feeling that such familiarity would be inappropriate. She withdrew Eleanor's letter and handed it to him, explaining only that Eleanor had asked her to deliver it. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope, recognizing Eleanor's handwriting on the address. Mary excused herself and left quickly, not wanting to be present when Jonathan read the contents. He waited until she had gone, then broke the seal and unfolded the pages. As he read Eleanor's words, his expression shifted from anticipation to anguish. The letter's generosity and selflessness made his own situation seem even more cowardly by comparison. Eleanor was releasing him from any obligation, but in doing so, she was highlighting the moral compromise he was making by choosing security over love, family obligation over personal conviction. He read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening his sense of despair. The elegant prose could not hide the pain beneath the surface, and he understood that Eleanor was sacrificing her own happiness out of consideration for him and for her family's security. It was an act of profound love, and it made the prospect of his marriage to Catherine Whitfield seem not just empty but morally repugnant. Jonathan sat in his study for over an hour, wrestling with a decision that would determine not just his future but the futures of everyone involved. The comfortable rationalizations he had constructed began to crumble under the weight of Eleanor's sacrifice. He had told himself that marrying Catherine was the responsible choice, that it protected the Morrison family while securing the business alliance his father demanded. But Eleanor's letter forced him to confront the truth. He was choosing comfort and privilege over love and principle, and no amount of justification could make that choice honorable. By noon, Jonathan had reached a decision that both terrified and liberated him. He would go to his father that very day and refuse definitively to marry Catherine Whitfield. He would accept disinheritance if necessary and find employment using his education, perhaps as a teacher or clerk in another town where the Crowe name carried no weight. More importantly, he would ask Eleanor to marry him, and together they would build a life based on their own merits rather than inherited wealth and position. It was a decision that would shock their entire community and destroy the social standing both families had worked generations to establish, but it was the only choice that allowed him to live with integrity. Jonathan left his study and went in search of his father, determined to have the confrontation immediately before his courage failed. He found Thomas Crowe in the estate office, reviewing production reports with his business manager. Jonathan asked for a private meeting, and his father, sensing the gravity of his son's demeanor, dismissed the manager and closed the door. They stood facing each other in the oak-paneled office, and Jonathan began to explain his decision. He had not completed 3 sentences before Thomas Crowe's face darkened with fury. The older man had anticipated resistance but had believed that time and social pressure would eventually bring his son around. To have Jonathan openly defy him just days before the engagement announcement represented not just disobedience but public humiliation. Thomas began to respond with threats of disinheritance and social destruction, but Jonathan interrupted with something his father had not expected: acceptance of those consequences. The argument escalated quickly, with years of tension between father and son erupting into open conflict. Jonathan accused his father of building wealth on the suffering of the mining families, pointing out that the company houses were barely habitable, that wages kept workers in perpetual debt to the company store, and that safety measures in the mines were criminally inadequate. Thomas countered that without the jobs he provided, these families would have nothing, that he had taken the financial risks that created employment, and that Jonathan's idealism was the product of privilege he had never had to earn. The confrontation reached its peak when Jonathan declared that he would marry Eleanor Morrison with or without his father's blessing and that he no longer wanted any part of the family business. Thomas Crowe's response was immediate and devastating. He declared Jonathan disinherited effective immediately, ordered him to leave the manor house by sunset, and promised that Robert Morrison would be dismissed from his position and evicted from his company house within the week. Furthermore, Thomas stated that he would use every bit of his influence to ensure that Jonathan would find no employment anywhere in eastern Kentucky, and that the Morrison family would be blacklisted from working in any mine or business with which the Crowe family had connections. Jonathan had expected disinheritance, but the vindictive comprehensiveness of his father's response shocked him. By targeting the Morrison family so directly, Thomas was ensuring that Jonathan's principled stand would bring ruin not just to himself but to the very people he was trying to protect. It was a calculated cruelty designed to force Jonathan's submission, and for a moment, it seemed to work. Jonathan staggered under the weight of what his father was threatening, understanding that his choice would condemn Eleanor and her family to poverty and possible starvation. But something in that moment hardened within Jonathan rather than breaking. He looked at his father and saw not a powerful patriarch but a cruel old man whose values represented everything wrong with their society. Without another word, Jonathan turned and left the office, walking through the manor house for what he knew would be the last time. He went to his room and began packing his essential belongings, his hands working automatically while his mind raced through possibilities and plans. News of the confrontation spread through the manor house staff with remarkable speed, and by early afternoon, whispers had reached the mining camp. Robert Morrison learned of it from a clerk who worked in the estate office, and the information hit him like a physical blow. He had spent weeks trying to protect his family from the consequences of Eleanor's relationship with Jonathan Crowe, and now it seemed that his worst fears were being realized. Thomas Crowe's reputation for vindictive retaliation was well known, and Robert understood that his family was about to lose everything. That he left the mining operations and hurried to his company house, finding Eleanor preparing lessons for the next day's classes. When he told her what had happened at the manor house, her reaction was not what he expected. Instead of the distress he anticipated, Eleanor's face showed a strange mixture of anguish and determination. She immediately understood that Jonathan had defied his father because of her letter, and she grasped the full scope of the disaster her relationship had brought upon both families. Eleanor made a decision in that moment that would set in motion events more tragic than anyone could have imagined. She told her father she was going to the manor house to speak with Thomas Crowe directly, to plead for her father's job and housing regardless of what happened between her and Jonathan. Robert tried to stop her, arguing that such a meeting would be pointless and would only further damage their situation, but Eleanor was adamant. She believed that if she could convince Thomas Crowe of her sincere intention to end the relationship and to leave the estate entirely, he might reconsider his vendetta against her family. Robert finally, reluctantly, agreed to let her go, on the condition that he accompany her. Together, father and daughter walked the path from the mining camp to the manor house, a journey of less than a mile that seemed to stretch endlessly. The afternoon had grown colder, and the fog that had lifted earlier was beginning to descend again, creating an atmosphere of unreality. Other workers watched them pass, understanding from their expressions that something significant was happening but not knowing the details. They arrived at the manor house and requested an audience with Thomas Crowe. After a delay during which they waited in the same sitting room where Mary Sullivan had waited earlier that day, they were admitted to the estate office. Thomas Crowe sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. He had been informed of their arrival and had agreed to see them primarily to drive home the finality of his decision regarding Robert Morrison's employment. Eleanor did most of the speaking, conducting herself with a dignity that impressed even Thomas Crowe despite his anger. She explained that she had already written to Jonathan ending their relationship, that she understood the impossibility of their situation, and that she was prepared to leave the estate and seek employment elsewhere to remove any temptation for Jonathan to defy his family's plans. She emphasized that her father had known nothing of her relationship with Jonathan until recently and should not be punished for her actions. She begged Thomas Crowe to reconsider his decision to dismiss Robert Morrison, arguing that 15 years of loyal service should not be discarded because of his daughter's foolish romantic notions. It was a compelling appeal, delivered with sincerity and humility, but Thomas Crowe was unmoved. He explained coldly that his decision was not about punishment but about ensuring that Jonathan understood the consequences of defiance. By targeting the Morrison family, he was making it impossible for Jonathan to pursue his relationship with Eleanor without destroying the lives of people he cared about. It was leverage, pure and simple, and Thomas had no intention of relinquishing it. Robert Morrison, who had remained silent during Eleanor's appeal, finally spoke. He addressed Thomas Crowe with the blunt honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. He pointed out that the cruelty of using innocent people as pawns in a family dispute spoke poorly of Thomas's character and contradicted the values of honor and integrity that prominent families claimed to uphold. He noted that Thomas's actions would harm not just the Morrison family but would create resentment among all the workers on the estate who would see how loyalty was repaid with vindictive destruction. These words, delivered without the deference Thomas was accustomed to receiving from his employees, triggered an explosion of rage. Thomas stood from his desk and ordered both Robert and Eleanor out of his office immediately. He reiterated that Robert Morrison was dismissed effective immediately and that the family had 48 hours to vacate their company house. Any attempt to remain beyond that time would result in forcible removal by estate security. Furthermore, he promised that he would personally ensure that Robert Morrison's reputation was destroyed throughout the region, making future employment impossible. Father and daughter left the office and the manor house, walking back toward the mining camp in stunned silence. The fog had grown thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards, and the temperature continued to drop. They walked side by side, each lost in thoughts about the catastrophe that had overtaken their lives. Eleanor was overwhelmed with guilt, understanding that her relationship with Jonathan had brought ruin to her family. Robert felt the bitter weight of failure, having been unable to protect his daughter or to maintain the security he had spent 15 years building. They did not know that Jonathan Crowe had witnessed their departure from an upstairs window of the manor house. He had watched Eleanor walking away through the fog, her figure gradually disappearing into the gray afternoon, and he had understood that this might be the last time he ever saw her. His belongings were packed, and he planned to leave the estate that evening, but he knew he could not simply abandon Eleanor and her family to the fate his father had decreed. He needed to find a way to protect them, to undo the damage his family had caused, but the means to do so eluded him. As darkness fell over Harlan County that Thursday evening, 3 separate tragedies were converging toward a point of catastrophic intersection. Jonathan Crowe sat in his room at the manor house, desperately trying to formulate a plan. Eleanor Morrison lay on her bed in the company house, her mind racing through impossible scenarios and finding no path forward. And Thomas Crowe remained in his estate office, reviewing papers and planning the engagement announcement that would proceed regardless of his son's defiance, never suspecting that his vindictive actions had set in motion consequences that would haunt the Crowe family for generations. The fog continued to thicken throughout the evening, blanketing the estate in a gray silence broken only by the distant sound of the Cumberland River and the occasional whistle from the mine shaft signaling the end of another shift. In the mining camp, word of the Morrison family's impending eviction spread through the small community, creating anger and sympathy in equal measure. Several families offered to take in the Morrisons temporarily, but everyone understood that in a company town where Thomas Crowe controlled virtually all employment, opposing his decisions meant risking one's own livelihood. As night deepened, the temperature plummeted, creating conditions that would have consequences no one anticipated. The unusual cold combined with the heavy fog to create a dangerous situation throughout the county, but particularly in areas where people were forced to move through unfamiliar terrain or make desperate decisions under pressure. The stage was set for the final chapters of this tragedy, where human cruelty and desperate choices would combine with the indifferent forces of nature to produce an outcome that would shock an entire community and leave scars that would never fully heal. Friday morning arrived without the fog lifting, an unusual meteorological phenomenon that left the entire region shrouded in gray obscurity. The temperature remained well below normal for late October in Kentucky, and ice had formed on the standing water near the Cumberland River and along the mining camp's dirt paths. Workers stumbled through the fog toward the mine entrance, their lamps creating small halos of light that barely penetrated the thick air. The conditions made mining operations more dangerous than usual, but Thomas Crowe had issued orders that production would continue regardless of weather, as delays would affect coal shipments already promised to buyers in Louisville and Cincinnati. Jonathan Crowe had spent a nearly sleepless night in his room at the manor house, his mind working through every possible scenario that might protect Eleanor and her family. By dawn, he had reached a conclusion that was both obvious and terrifying. He needed to leave immediately and take Eleanor with him. They would travel to another state, somewhere beyond his father's influence, and build a new life together. It would mean abandoning every comfort he had known, but the alternative, allowing Eleanor to suffer because of their relationship, was unacceptable. He packed his remaining belongings into 2 leather bags, taking only what he could carry and leaving behind the trappings of his privileged upbringing. Among the items he kept were several $100s he had saved from allowances over the years, money that would sustain them for a few months while he sought employment. He also took documents that proved his education, thinking they might help him secure a teaching position or clerical work in whatever city they chose as their destination. Before leaving the manor house, Jonathan composed a letter to his father. Unlike Eleanor's gracious farewell, Jonathan's words were harsh and uncompromising. He detailed his disgust with the family business and its exploitation of workers, condemned his father's vindictive treatment of the Morrison family, and declared that he wanted no part of wealth built on human suffering. He stated that he was leaving to marry Eleanor Morrison and that they would make their own way in the world without the Crowe name or fortune. The letter was an act of defiance and liberation, burning every bridge that might have allowed reconciliation. Jonathan left the letter on his father's desk in the estate office, placed it there in the early morning when he knew Thomas would be at breakfast. Then he slipped out of the manor house through a servant's entrance, carrying his bags and moving through the fog toward the mining camp. The visibility was so poor that he nearly lost his way twice, forced to navigate by memory and the sound of the river to guide him. The cold penetrated his coat, and his breath created additional clouds of vapor in the already obscure air. He reached the Morrison family's company house shortly after 7 in the morning. Robert Morrison had already left for what he knew would be one of his final days supervising the mining operations, determined to fulfill his duties professionally even as he faced dismissal. Eleanor answered Jonathan's knock, and her expression when she saw him standing in the fog showed surprise, confusion, and something else. A flicker of hope that she had tried to extinguish but which refused to die completely. Jonathan entered the small house, noting its stark contrast to the manor he had just left. The Morrison home consisted of 4 rooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, a sitting area with mismatched furniture, and 2 small bedrooms separated by a thin wall. Everything was clean and carefully maintained, but the poverty of it was evident in the worn fabrics, the patched curtains, and the general air of making do with insufficient resources. Yet there was a warmth here that the manor house had never possessed, a sense that the people who lived here actually cared for one another. Eleanor offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they sat at the small kitchen table while Jonathan explained his plan. He spoke quickly, urgently, aware that every minute increased the risk of discovery. He told her about his confrontation with his father, about the letter he had left, and about his decision to leave the estate permanently. Most importantly, he asked her to come with him, to marry him and build a new life somewhere far from Kentucky where their love would not be constrained by class distinctions or family expectations. Eleanor listened with increasing alarm as Jonathan outlined his proposal. While part of her desperately wanted to accept, to escape the impossible situation and be with the man she loved, another part recognized the profound recklessness of what he was suggesting. She pointed out that his plan would not protect her family from his father's vengeance. Indeed, it might make things worse by confirming Thomas Crowe's belief that Jonathan had been corrupted by an inappropriate relationship. She noted that they would be traveling in dangerous weather conditions with limited resources and no clear destination. She reminded him that as an unmarried woman traveling with a man, her reputation would be destroyed, making it difficult for her to find respectable employment even if they reached a city where the Crowe name meant nothing. Jonathan countered each objection with arguments born of desperation rather than reason. He insisted that once they were married, her reputation would be protected. He claimed that his father's anger would eventually fade and that Robert Morrison's competence would allow him to find work elsewhere. He promised that his education and abilities would allow them to prosper in whatever city they chose. But beneath these assurances, both of them understood the truth. This was not a well-planned escape but a desperate gamble with stakes that included not just their futures but their very survival. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, circling through the same arguments and objections. Eleanor vacillated between refusing entirely and tentatively accepting, torn between her love for Jonathan and her understanding of the practical realities they faced. Jonathan grew increasingly agitated, sensing that if he could not convince her to leave immediately, the opportunity would be lost. His father would certainly discover his departure within hours, and Thomas Crowe had sufficient resources and connections to pursue them if they remained anywhere in Kentucky. Finally, Eleanor made a decision that was as much emotional as rational. She agreed to go with Jonathan, but with conditions. She would leave a letter for her father explaining her choice and absolving him of any responsibility for her actions. They would travel first to Pineville, a town about 40 miles north where her mother's sister lived, and there they would be married by a justice of the peace before continuing further. The presence of family at the wedding and the legal formalization of their union would provide at least some protection against accusations of impropriety. With this agreement reached, Eleanor quickly packed a small bag with her essential belongings and her modest savings. She composed a letter to her father that echoed the selfless tone of her earlier letter to Jonathan, explaining that she was leaving to protect the family and to pursue her own happiness. She asked for his forgiveness and promised to write once they were safely established elsewhere. She left the letter on the kitchen table where Robert would find it when he returned from the mines. Jonathan and Eleanor left the company house shortly before 9 in the morning, walking quickly through the fog-shrouded mining camp. Several workers saw them passing, but in the poor visibility could not identify them clearly. They made their way to the road that led north toward Pineville, Jonathan carrying both bags while Eleanor clutched her coat against the cold. The temperature seemed to be dropping even further, and the fog remained impenetrable, creating a disorienting white void through which they moved like ghosts. They had not traveled more than 2 miles when they encountered their first serious obstacle. The road, which Jonathan had traveled many times in better conditions, was nearly impossible to follow in the fog. What had seemed like a clear path in his mind became a confusion of possible turns and divergent routes. They proceeded slowly, Jonathan attempting to maintain their direction by keeping the slope of the land consistent and by listening for sounds that might orient them. But the fog muffled everything, and the cold numbed their senses, making accurate judgment increasingly difficult. By midday, they were forced to admit that they were lost. The road they had been following had become a rough trail, and then the trail had disappeared entirely into forest undergrowth. They stood in a clearing surrounded by bare trees, their branches creating dark patterns against the gray void of the fog. Jonathan tried to maintain an optimistic demeanor, but Eleanor could see the worry in his eyes. They had brought no food, thinking they would reach Pineville by afternoon, and their clothing, while adequate for a journey on proper roads, was insufficient for extended exposure to these conditions. Jonathan proposed that they continue in what he believed was still a northern direction, arguing that they must eventually encounter either a road or a settlement. Eleanor agreed, having no better alternative to suggest. They pressed on through the forest, pushing through undergrowth and climbing over fallen logs, their progress slowing to a crawl. The bags Jonathan carried grew heavier with each passing hour, and Eleanor's shoes, designed for town where rather than wilderness travel, were quickly ruined by the rough terrain. As afternoon turned toward evening, their situation became increasingly desperate. They had not encountered any sign of human habitation, and Eleanor was beginning to show signs of serious cold exposure. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and she was shivering uncontrollably despite Jonathan's efforts to keep her moving. He gave her his coat, but this only transferred the danger from her to himself. The temperature continued to drop, and they both understood that spending a night in these conditions without shelter or fire would likely be fatal. Jonathan finally admitted that they needed to stop and attempt to create some form of shelter rather than continuing to wander aimlessly. They found a cluster of dense evergreen trees that provided some protection from the wind and began gathering dead branches and leaves to create a crude lean-to structure. The work was difficult in their weakened state, and the materials they gathered were damp from the fog, making them poor insulation. But it was the best they could do under the circumstances. As darkness fell, they huddled together in their inadequate shelter, sharing body heat and trying to maintain hope. Jonathan berated himself for his reckless planning, understanding now that his desperation to protect Eleanor had led him to endanger her life far more seriously than his father's vindictiveness ever could have. Eleanor, despite her own discomfort and fear, tried to comfort Jonathan, understanding that his actions had come from love even if they had proven disastrous in execution. They talked through the early hours of the night, sharing memories and dreams, speaking words of love that neither of them was certain they would survive to fulfill. The cold was relentless, penetrating their clothing and their makeshift shelter, making sleep impossible and clear thought increasingly difficult. Jonathan's mind began to wander, mixing reality with half-dreams of rescue and warmth. Eleanor fought to stay alert, afraid that if she succumbed to sleep in these conditions she might not wake up. Meanwhile, back at the Crowe estate, their disappearance had been discovered and had triggered chaos. Thomas Crowe had found Jonathan's letter mid-morning and had immediately organized search parties. His initial fury at his son's defiance had been replaced by genuine concern when reports came in about the severity of the weather conditions. Whatever anger he felt toward Jonathan, he did not want his son to die in the wilderness, particularly in a manner that would bring scandal and investigation to the family. Robert Morrison had returned from the mines to find Eleanor's letter and had experienced his own horror at realizing his daughter had left with Jonathan Crowe in such dangerous conditions. He had gone immediately to the manor house to report Eleanor's departure, setting aside his anger at Thomas Crowe in the face of a more immediate crisis. The two men, enemies just days before, found themselves united in desperate concern for their children's safety. Search parties had been organized by early afternoon, with estate workers and miners combing the roads leading away from the property. But the fog made searching nearly impossible, and as darkness fell, the efforts had to be abandoned until morning. Robert Morrison had refused to stop, continuing to call Eleanor's name into the fog long after the other searchers had given up. Thomas Crowe had remained in his estate office, alternating between organizing additional resources for the morning search and grappling with the realization that his vindictive actions had driven his son and Eleanor Morrison into mortal danger. As Friday night deepened into Saturday morning, 3 separate dramas were playing out in the fog-shrouded landscape of Harlan County. Jonathan and Eleanor clung to life in their inadequate shelter, their consciousness drifting in and out as hypothermia began to take hold. Robert Morrison wandered through the forest calling his daughter's name until exhaustion finally forced him to return to the estate. And Thomas Crowe sat alone in his study, facing for perhaps the first time in his life the full weight of his actions and their consequences. The final chapter of this tragedy was about to unfold, and it would bring a resolution that satisfied no one while leaving scars on all who survived it. Saturday morning broke with a slight lifting of the fog, though the cold remained intense and ice now coated every surface. The improved visibility allowed search parties to organize more effectively, and by first light, over 50 men were spreading out across the region where Jonathan and Eleanor were believed to have traveled. Thomas Crowe had offered a substantial reward for information leading to their safe return, and Robert Morrison personally led one of the search groups, his face haggard from lack of sleep and his movements driven by desperate determination. The search party that found them consisted of 6 miners led by Robert Morrison. They had been following what they thought might be tracks, though the frost made identification difficult, when they heard what sounded like a weak cry. Moving toward the sound, they discovered the crude shelter Jonathan had constructed and found the 2 young people inside, both barely conscious and showing severe signs of cold exposure. Jonathan was attempting to shield Eleanor with his body, and both were shivering so violently that they could barely speak. The miners immediately began emergency measures, wrapping both victims in their own coats and starting a fire to warm them gradually. They sent a runner back to the estate to bring a wagon and medical supplies while they worked to raise Jonathan and Eleanor's core temperatures. Robert Morrison held his daughter, speaking to her urgently and trying to keep her alert and responsive. Eleanor's awareness came and went in waves, and when she recognized her father, she began to cry, apologizing repeatedly for the pain she had caused. Jonathan's condition was actually more severe than Eleanor's, as he had given up his coat to protect her during the night and had absorbed more direct exposure to the cold. His lips and fingertips showed dangerous discoloration, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. The miners worked on both victims with competence born of experience dealing with mining accidents, but they understood that the next few hours would be critical in determining whether permanent damage or death would result from the exposure. The wagon arrived within an hour, driven by estate workers and accompanied by Dr. Samuel Harrison, the physician who served both the Crowe family and the mining camp. Dr. Harrison made a quick assessment of both patients and ordered them transported immediately to the manor house where he could provide proper medical care. There was some objection to taking Eleanor to the manor house rather than her family's company house, but Dr. Harrison overruled these concerns, explaining that Eleanor's condition required facilities and supplies that were not available in the mining camp. The journey back to the estate took over 2 hours, with the wagon moving slowly to avoid jostling the patients. Jonathan remained semi-conscious throughout the trip, occasionally murmuring words that were mostly incoherent but which seemed to be attempts to apologize. Eleanor drifted between awareness and unconsciousness, at times seeming to recognize her surroundings and at other times appearing completely disoriented. They arrived at the manor house shortly before noon on Saturday, and both patients were taken to separate bedrooms where Dr. Harrison could work on them with the assistance of the household staff. Thomas Crowe watched from the hallway as his son was carried past, his expression unreadable but his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the door frame. Robert Morrison remained with Eleanor, refusing to leave her side despite Dr. Harrison's suggestion that he might want to rest after his sleepless night. Over the next 24 hours, Dr. Harrison worked tirelessly to save both patients. Jonathan's condition initially worsened, with fever developing as his body struggled to recover from the extreme cold exposure. Dr. Harrison feared pneumonia, a common and often fatal complication of hypothermia, and he applied every treatment available to prevent or combat the respiratory infection. Eleanor's recovery proceeded more smoothly, though she remained weak and developed severe frostbite in her feet that would require weeks of careful treatment. By Sunday afternoon, it became clear that both patients would survive, though Jonathan's recovery would be longer and more uncertain than Eleanor's. The fever had broken, but he remained very weak and showed signs of respiratory distress that worried Dr. Harrison. Eleanor had regained full consciousness and had been able to take some food, though the pain in her frostbitten feet was severe and would leave lasting damage. During this crisis period, something remarkable had occurred within the manor house. The desperate race to save Jonathan and Eleanor had broken down, temporarily at least, some of the rigid class barriers that normally governed interactions on the estate. Thomas Crowe had personally spoken with Robert Morrison, not as employer to employee but as one father to another, both facing the possible loss of their children due to circumstances they had helped create. The conversation had been brief and awkward, but it represented a crack in the social structure that had seemed immutable just days before. The engagement ball scheduled for that Saturday evening had been cancelled, with messages sent to the Whitfield family explaining that a family emergency required postponement. Harrison Whitfield had responded with appropriate expressions of concern, but it was clear that the situation was being re-evaluated. Catherine Whitfield herself had reportedly expressed relief at the delay, suggesting that the proposed marriage had been no more appealing to her than it had been to Jonathan. By Monday morning, both patients were clearly on the path to recovery, though Jonathan would require several more weeks of rest and observation. Eleanor was able to sit up and carry on conversations, though the pain in her feet remained intense. It was during one of these periods of lucidity that Thomas Crowe requested permission to speak with her privately, a request that both surprised and worried Robert Morrison. The conversation took place in Eleanor's sick room with Robert Morrison present, but standing at a distance. Thomas Crowe approached Eleanor's bed with an expression far different from the stern authority he normally projected. He began by apologizing, words that clearly cost him significant effort but which seemed genuine in their expression. He acknowledged that his vindictive response to Jonathan's defiance had driven both young people into a situation that had nearly cost them their lives. He admitted that his obsession with maintaining family pride and business alliances had blinded him to the human costs of his decisions. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her own exhaustion making her responses measured and careful. When Thomas finished his apology, she responded with a maturity that impressed even the hardened businessman. She acknowledged her own role in creating the situation, admitting that pursuing a relationship across such significant class barriers had been naive and that she had not fully considered the consequences for her family. She expressed no anger toward Thomas Crowe, only a profound sadness at how much pain had been caused by circumstances that no one involved had been able to control effectively. The conversation then turned to practical matters, specifically the question of what would happen next. Thomas Crowe had clearly given this considerable thought during the crisis. He proposed a solution that was generous in some respects but which still maintained certain boundaries he was unwilling to cross. He offered to withdraw his order dismissing Robert Morrison and to allow the Morrison family to remain in their company house indefinitely. He would ensure that Eleanor received the best possible medical care for her injured feet and would bear all expenses related to the emergency. Furthermore, he would provide a substantial financial settlement to the Morrison family, enough to allow Eleanor to relocate to another city if she chose and to establish herself independently. The condition attached to these offers was implicit but clear. The relationship between Jonathan and Eleanor must end permanently. They would not be allowed to see each other during their recoveries, and once both were healed, Eleanor would need to leave the estate and make her life elsewhere. Thomas was offering protection and compensation, but not acceptance of a marriage that would, in his view, diminish his family's standing and complicate the business relationships he had spent decades building. Eleanor accepted these terms without argument, understanding that they represented as much compromise as Thomas Crowe was capable of making. She was too exhausted and in too much pain to fight for a different outcome, and she recognized that her near-death experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on what was worth sacrificing for love. Robert Morrison, while not entirely satisfied with the arrangement, understood that it was far better than the vindictive destruction Thomas had threatened just days earlier. Jonathan's reaction to these arrangements, when he was finally strong enough to be informed of them, was one of anguish and frustration. He had not gone through his ordeal and nearly died only to accept his father's continued control over his life. But his weakened condition left him in no position to resist, and the practicalities of the situation were undeniable. Eleanor had nearly died because of his reckless rescue attempt, and pursuing the relationship further would only expose her to more danger and hardship. Dr. Harrison, who had remained at the manor house throughout the crisis, played an unexpected role in helping Jonathan come to terms with the situation. During one of his examinations, the doctor spoke bluntly about the realities both young people faced. He pointed out that Jonathan's respiratory damage from the cold exposure might leave him with chronic health problems that would make manual labor difficult. He noted that Eleanor's frostbite injuries would likely cause her permanent mobility issues that would complicate her ability to work as a teacher. He suggested, without directly stating it, that both young people had been given a second chance at life and that throwing away that chance by continuing to fight against impossible circumstances would be foolish. Over the following weeks, as both patients slowly recovered, the new arrangements took shape. Eleanor remained in the manor house during her initial recovery period, occupying a guest room far from where Jonathan was being treated. They were not allowed to see each other, a prohibition enforced by household staff and accepted, however reluctantly, by both parties. Robert Morrison visited his daughter daily, and these visits gradually rebuilt the relationship that had been strained by the earlier crisis. Jonathan's recovery was slower and more complicated than Eleanor's. The respiratory damage Dr. Harrison had warned about proved real, leaving Jonathan with a persistent cough and reduced stamina that would likely affect him for the rest of his life. He used the long hours of convalescence to read and think, processing what had happened and trying to make sense of the tragedy that had nearly claimed both his and Eleanor's lives. As January turned toward February, Eleanor was judged well enough to be moved from the manor house. Thomas Crowe had made arrangements for her to stay with a family in Lexington while she completed her recovery and decided on her future plans. The financial settlement he had promised was substantial, enough to allow her to attend a teacher's college or to establish herself in a new city where the scandal of her relationship with Jonathan Crowe would not follow her. The day of Eleanor's departure brought the only direct contact she and Jonathan would have during their recovery period. She asked permission to say goodbye, and Thomas Crowe, perhaps feeling that he owed them this small concession, allowed a brief meeting in the manor house sitting room with Robert Morrison present. Jonathan was able to walk short distances by this point, though he tired easily and his cough remained troublesome. They sat facing each other in the formal sitting room, both changed physically by their ordeal. Eleanor's face had thinned during her illness, and she walked with a noticeable limp that Dr. Harrison believed would improve but never completely disappear. Jonathan appeared older than his 28 years, his features marked by the illness he had suffered and by the weight of everything that had occurred. Their conversation was brief and painful, filled with things left unsaid because Robert Morrison's presence and the watchful eyes of the household staff prevented any real intimacy. Eleanor thanked Jonathan for trying to protect her, and he apologized for putting her in danger. They spoke carefully around their feelings, acknowledging their love while accepting that circumstances had made acting on that love impossible. When Eleanor stood to leave, Jonathan remained seated, whether from weakness or from the desire to prolong the moment it was impossible to say. Eleanor left the manor house in a hired carriage arranged by Thomas Crowe, traveling toward Lexington and a future that was uncertain but at least offered possibility. She did not look back at the manor house as the carriage departed, understanding that looking back would only make the departure harder. Robert Morrison accompanied her to help her settle in Lexington, and his presence provided some comfort during the journey. Jonathan watched from a window as the carriage disappeared down the road, and something in that moment finalized the transformation that had been occurring during his recovery. The idealistic young man who had believed that love could overcome all obstacles had been replaced by someone more pragmatic but also more deeply scarred. He would eventually take up some role in the family business, never with enthusiasm but with a sense of duty born from understanding that his health problems limited his alternatives. His relationship with his father would remain distant and formal, marked by mutual disappointment and occasional flashes of the conflict that had precipitated the tragedy. Thomas Crowe had achieved his objective of preventing Jonathan's marriage to Eleanor Morrison, but the victory had come at a cost he had not fully anticipated. The near death of his only son had shaken him more than he would admit, and the social scandal surrounding the incident had damaged the family's reputation in ways that business success could not entirely repair. The engagement to Catherine Whitfield was never revived, as the Whitfield family quietly withdrew from the arrangement citing changed circumstances. Robert Morrison continued working as foreman at the Crowe mining operations, his competence and dedication unchanged by the crisis. But something had shifted in his relationship with both Thomas Crowe and with the social order he had always accepted as natural. He advocated more forcefully for improvements to working conditions and compensation, and Thomas, perhaps feeling some continuing guilt over what had occurred, was more willing to implement these changes than he might have been otherwise. The mining community remembered the incident as a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing class boundaries and the tragedy that could result from forbidden romances. But some of the workers also saw in it evidence that the wealthy and powerful could be forced to recognize the humanity of those below them in the social hierarchy, that even Thomas Crowe could be moved to compassion when faced with the consequences of his actions. Eleanor Morrison built a new life in Lexington, eventually completing her education and becoming a respected teacher at a school for girls. She never married, though whether this was by choice or because of the lingering scandals surrounding her relationship with Jonathan Crowe, no one could say with certainty. She maintained correspondence with her father but never returned to Harlan County, finding that the memories associated with that place were too painful to revisit in later years. She would occasionally receive letters from Jonathan, carefully written notes that expressed concern for her well-being and provided updates on his life without ever suggesting that their relationship might be renewed. She responded to these letters with similar restraint, maintaining a connection that was both painful and necessary, a reminder of the love they had shared and the price they had paid for pursuing it. Jonathan Crowe lived until 1932, his later years marked by the respiratory problems that had begun during his ordeal in the wilderness. He never married, and in his final years he established a charitable foundation that provided scholarships for the children of mining families, perhaps trying to make amends in some small way for the injustices his family's business had perpetuated. Eleanor Morrison outlived him by 8 years, receiving notification of his death by letter from an attorney handling his estate. She attended no funeral service but spent a quiet day alone in her small house, remembering the young man who had loved her enough to risk everything and whose recklessness had nearly destroyed them both. The Crowe family eventually sold their mining operations in Kentucky and moved their business interests to other ventures, and the manor house that had been the setting for so much drama eventually fell into disrepair and was demolished in 1947. The mining camp where Eleanor had taught and where the Morrison family had lived was abandoned when the coal deposits were exhausted, leaving only foundations and memories of the community that had once thrived there. The story of Jonathan Crowe and Eleanor Morrison became a local legend, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Some versions portrayed it as a tragic romance destroyed by class prejudice, while others emphasized the recklessness and poor judgment that had nearly cost 2 young people their lives. But all versions agreed on the essential sadness of what had occurred. 2 people who had loved each other had been separated by circumstances they could not control and by decisions that seemed right at the time but which had led to consequences no one had anticipated or desired. In the end, the Crowe family's forbidden bride was forbidden not by supernatural forces or impossible circumstances but by the very human forces of social prejudice, economic power, and the complex ways that love and duty can conflict to create tragedies that satisfy no one. It was a horror story not of ghosts or monsters but of wasted lives and lost possibilities, of the ways that rigid social structures and uncompromising personalities could destroy happiness as surely as any curse or dark magic. And unlike the supernatural horrors that existed only in imagination, this horror was terribly, painfully real, leaving scars on all who survived it and casting shadows that would extend across generations. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel, Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.